History often remembers battles by their victors. But some defeats echo louder than any triumph because they expose pride, guilt, and human weakness in their rawest form. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a king who carried his sins into war, of a queen who ruled with steel beneath silk, and of an army so powerful it mistook inevitability for invincibility. What happened in September of 1513 was not an accident. It was a collision between medieval honor and modern war, between emotion and calculation, between rain-soaked ground and iron-bound pride. To understand the massacre that followed, we must begin not with strategy, but with a corpse in the mud. Picture this moment. It is September 10th, 1513. You are standing in a field that has stopped fighting but has not stopped killing. The ground beneath your feet is not earth anymore. It is churned mud, soaked black with blood. The battle is over. The screams are not. Looters crawl across the field like insects, tearing armor from the dead. Every minute, another nobleman is stripped clean, titles erased, bodies reduced to meat. Then someone rolls over a corpse and freezes. This one is different. Wrapped tightly around the man's waist, biting deep in his swollen, infected flesh, is a heavy iron chain. Not a weapon, not a trophy, a burden. You are staring at the body of King James IV of Scotland. This is not merely a fallen soldier. This is the last reigning monarch in the British Isles to die butchered on a battlefield. That iron belt was not placed there by English hands. It was his own, a private act of penance he dragged with him into the catastrophe history would call the Battle of Flodden. In less than 3 hours, James led the largest, most technologically advanced army Scotland had ever assembled straight into annihilation, wiping out an entire generation of its leadership. How does a brilliant king end up naked in the mud, weighed down by his own guilt? To understand the slaughter, you must understand the man. James IV was no fool. He was a Renaissance force of nature. While England wrestled with internal instability, James transformed Scotland into a sharpened blade. He spoke 8 languages. He funded alchemical experiments. He personally performed surgical procedures to test emerging medical theories. He didn't merely build a navy, he launched the Great Michael, a warship so massive it stunned Europe. James was wealthy, educated, innovative, and dangerously self-assured. But he was also haunted. That iron chain tells the truth no chronicle does. As a teenager, James had led a rebellion against his own father. The uprising ended in murder. The crown was won, but the guilt shattered him. He ordered the chain forged and locked it around his waist as lifelong punishment. Each year, on the anniversary of his father's death, he added another link. He wanted to feel the burden grow heavier as he aged. That growing weight became a ticking psychological clock, driving James toward redemption through glory. And in 1513, he believed opportunity had finally arrived. His brother-in-law, Henry VIII, had crossed the Channel and invaded France, leaving England seemingly exposed. James didn't hesitate. He didn't limit the campaign. He emptied his kingdom. This was not a levy of desperate peasants. James summoned the full might of Scotland, over 30,000 men, possibly closer to 40,000. They marched in the latest European plate armor, drilled in modern continental tactics, armed with 18-foot pikes modeled after the terrifying Swiss formations dominating Europe. Behind them rumbled the real terror. James adored artillery, and he brought the finest guns Scotland had ever cast. At the heart of the train were the 7 Sisters, 7 identical bronze cannons, masterpieces forged by master gunner Robert Borthwick. These were not crude relics. They were precision instruments capable of reducing stone fortresses to rubble from staggering distances. It took 400 oxen just to drag them. When this army crossed the River Tweed, it didn't invade, it crushed. The English border fortresses of Nareham, Edel, and Ford, which had resisted sieges for centuries, collapsed in days. The 7 Sisters roared. The walls fell. Victory felt inevitable. And that was the danger. James treated the invasion like a royal hunt. His army feasted, slept in captured English beds, and waited for surrender offers that never came. But while the Scots celebrated, the weather turned. The skies darkened. Rain fell without mercy. Roads dissolved into glue. The massive cannons began to sink. Armor that gleamed on parade grounds grew suffocatingly heavy. The long pikes, perfect for dry European plains, became unwieldy in the slick, rolling hills of Northumberland. James had built a siege army for summer warfare on firm ground. He had built a Ferrari and driven it straight into a swamp. Unbeknownst to him, his greatest strengths were quietly becoming his death sentence. While James played the gallant knight, a very different force clawed its way north. If the Scottish army was a shining Ferrari, the English host was a rusted pickup truck, battered, ugly, and impossible to kill. Leading it was Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey. At 70 years old, ancient by the standards of the day, Surrey should have been retired. Instead, he rode through relentless storms, joints screaming, body failing, driven by desperation. He was a survivor of the Wars of the Roses, a man who had lost everything and clawed his way back inch by inch. If he failed, the Tudors would execute him. If he won, his family's honor would be restored. He had nothing to lose. Surrey's army was no polished force. He scraped together 26,000 men from the northern counties, Yorkshiremen, Lancastrians, borderers. They wore padded jacks soaked in vinegar, not shining Milan steel. They carried billhooks, farm tools turned into brutal weapons designed to tear men apart at close range. They were hungry. They were exhausted. They drank from puddles and slept in ditches. But they marched. Surrey drove them relentlessly across bog and hill, covering ground at a pace that should not have been possible. While the Scots celebrated their easy victories, a desperate pack of wolves was closing in, silent, soaked, and starving. And soon, the mud would decide everything. There was one more enemy on the field, one no commander could outflank: the rain. The famous English longbow, the weapon that had shattered French armies at Agincourt and Crécy, was almost useless now. Wet bowstring sagged, arrow glue softened, fletchings loosened and warped. Surrey understood this almost immediately. This would not be a contest of arrows arcing through the sky. This would be a knife fight in a phone booth. As the English trudged toward the Scottish position, they looked less like soldiers and more like survivors pulled from flood. Exhausted, starving, soaked through, but they carried something the Scots did not: desperation. These men were fighting on their own soil for their homes, their families, and whatever waited behind them. On September 5th, the Old Wolf arrived. Surrey stood before James's army, perched high on Flodden Edge, a natural fortress bristling with cannon. A younger, prouder commander might have ordered a suicidal uphill charge. Surrey did not. He studied the position, spat into the mud, and chose deception. He would not play James's game. This was the moment the battle was truly decided, not with steel, but with a map. James IV sat confidently atop Flodden Edge, a steep hill surrounded by marshland, its approaches deadly. Any frontal assault would have been slaughter. James knew it. Surrey knew it. So James waited, dry and secure, daring the English to blunder. Surrey even sent taunting letters, challenging James to descend and fight on equal ground. James refused. His reply was simple and regal: "I am a king. I stand where I choose." So Surrey flipped the board. On the morning of September 9th, he did something that appeared insane. He broke camp and marched away. From the Scottish hilltops, it looked like victory. The English were retreating. They weren't. Surrey was executing one of the boldest flanking maneuvers in medieval warfare, marching his army in a wide arc, crossing the river till at Twisel Bridge, looping behind the Scottish position. And here lies the tragedy of James IV, frozen in a single moment. As the English crossed that narrow stone bridge, single file, compressed, vulnerable Scottish artillery officers begged for permission to fire. One volley from the Seven Sisters would have annihilated the crossing. The bridge would have vanished. The English army would have ceased to exist. James refused. Some historians blame confusion or poor visibility. But the darker explanation fits the man with the iron chain. James would not strike an enemy while crossing a river. It was not chivalrous. It was not honorable. He wanted a battle of heroes, not a massacre of logistics. He got exactly what he wished for, and it cost him everything. By afternoon, panic rippled through the Scottish ranks. Surrey had not retreated. He had appeared behind them. The English army now stood between James and Scotland. The road home was cut. In an instant, James was no longer the invader. He was the trapped animal. The Scots were forced to abandon their impregnable position and pivot their massive formation, a chaotic, exhausting maneuver under pressure. They descended from Flodden Edge to the lower ground of Brankston Hill to face the threat behind them. As the rain began to ease, the two armies finally stood opposite one another. But the war had changed. James was no longer fighting for conquest. He was fighting a breakout. At around 4 in the afternoon, the first fuse was lit. The Battle of Flodden did not begin with swords. It began with the loudest man-made sound the British Isles had ever heard. Master Gunner Robert Borthwick stood beside the Seven Sisters and gave the order. The ground convulsed as the colossal bronze cannons roared, hurling iron shot the size of human heads down toward the English lines. On paper, this should have ended the battle. High ground, bigger guns, longer range. But physics showed no mercy. The Scottish cannons sat too high, mounted on siege carriages designed to batter castle walls, not fire downhill. The barrels could not depress far enough. The iron shot screamed harmlessly over English heads and buried itself in the mud beyond. The Pride of Scotland was firing ghosts. Below, English master gunner Sir Nicholas Appleyard made no such mistake. His guns were smaller, uglier, and built for field warfare. Firing uphill gave him perfect elevation. He ordered rapid bombardment. English cannon fire tore directly into the tightly packed Scottish formations. Worse still, they unleashed hail, shot, bags of metal fragments that turned cannons into giant shotguns. Men standing shoulder to shoulder had nowhere to escape. Plate armor split, limbs shattered, heads vanished, and then came the smoke. Black powder filled the valley with thick, choking fog. Within minutes, the Scots were being butchered by an enemy they could not see, taking fire they could not return. James watched his grand design collapse. His artillery was useless. His men were dying where they stood. There was only one option left. He drew his sword. James did not retreat. He ordered charge. He commanded his pikemen to kick off their boots for traction in the mud and lower their 18-foot spears. The long game had failed. He wagered everything on shock and momentum. The Scottish army surged downhill, plunging into smoke and chaos, leaving the safety of high ground for the killing field below. At first, it worked. 10,000 armored men moved as one, pikes leveled, a rolling forest of steel. This was the Swiss push, the most advanced infantry tactic in Europe. The English front line buckled under its weight. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like James would break through. Then the land intervened. At the base of the hill lay a shallow marsh, a stream choked with sucking mud. Pike formations demand one thing above all else: cohesion. Shoulder to shoulder, step for step. The Scots lost it instantly. Men slipped, lines twisted, heavy armor dragged bodies into the mire. Pikes tangled, stabbed comrades, and buried themselves uselessly in the mud. Gaps opened, and the English surged forward. Light, mobile, unburdened, they ducked under the wavering pike tips and rushed inside the guard. At close range, an 18-foot spear is not a weapon, it is a liability. The Scots dropped their pikes and reached for swords, axes, and daggers. In that moment, they abandoned the modern army James had built and fell into a desperate medieval brawl. They did not realize they had stepped into the final trap. Because in the crushing press of bodies, swords were not king. The king was a peasant's tool, and it was about to turn the stream red. The duel between billhook and pike had begun, and the pike had already lost. This is the moment the battlefield stopped being a contest and became a crime scene. When the Scots abandoned their pikes and drew their swords, they believed they were stepping into honorable combat, steel against steel, knight against knight. What they actually stepped into was an industrial slaughter run by English peasants. The weapon that defined this massacre was not the sword. It was the billhook. To understand the horror of Flodden, you have to understand this crude, brutal tool. A billhook was nothing more than a curved blade mounted on a 6-foot pole, originally meant for cutting thick branches. But in the hands of desperate farmers, it became a perfect anti-armor weapon. It could hook, chop, and stab. It dragged men down, shattered bone, and found the weak seams in steel. It was not elegant. It was efficient, a working man's solution to killing a knight. In the suffocating mud of the valley, the Scottish broadsword became useless. A sword needs space, room to swing, to recover, to strike again. There was no space. The crush was so intense that men were dying upright, suffocated by the weight of their own formation, arms pinned to their sides. The English billmen didn't need space. They worked methodically. A hook caught the back of a knee or the rim of a helmet. A yank sent a noble crashing into the filth. Once a man in 60 pounds of plate armor was on his back in the mud, he was finished. He was a turtle flipped onto its shell, helpless, panicked, sinking. Then came the killing stroke. The billmen drove spikes into armpits, groins, and visor slits, places no armor could fully protect. One clean thrust, and another name vanished from Scotland's ruling class. There is a brutal irony here that cannot be ignored. This was not just a military defeat, it was a social execution. The men dying in the mud were earls, bishops, lords. Men raised in stone halls, accustomed to silk and silver. The men killing them were the poor, the unwashed, the overlooked farmers of northern England. It was a harvest. The English commoners were cutting down the Scottish aristocracy like wheat. Later examinations of the bodies told the story clearly. Many skulls were split straight down the middle, from crown to jaw, the unmistakable signature of a billhook swung with the full strength of a lifetime of manual labor. The Red River was no metaphor. Blood mixed with rain until the ground became a sucking slurry, trapping the wounded where they fell. The Scots fought with astonishing bravery, but bravery could not save them from physics, mud, and mass steel. And at the center of that storm, King James IV was fighting forward. He pushed through bodies, over friends, cousins, companions, driven by rage and guilt toward the man he blamed for it all, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey. History knows many kings who watched battles from safe hills. James was not one of them. As his army collapsed, he did not flee. He did not signal retreat. He dismounted, seized a weapon, and stepped into the mud with his men. It was tactically foolish and morally absolute. If Scotland was to die that day, he would die with her. What followed was one of the most desperate last stands in European history. James led a wedge of elite knights straight into the English lines. They fought like men already dead, carving a bloody corridor toward the English banners. Chroniclers say James came within a spear's length of Surrey himself. Close enough to see him, close enough to smell him. But he never reached him. English archers and billmen closed in. Arrows struck James, slowing him. Then a billhook swung from the chaos and tore through his jaw. Another blow smashed into his neck. The King of Scots fell. He did not die instantly. He bled into the mud, trampled by men who did not know who he was or what they had just done. Around his body, the last of Scotland's chivalry formed a ring. Earls, bishops, clan chiefs refused to surrender. They fought until they were cut down, layer upon layer, forming a grotesque monument of loyalty. When the English cleared the field the next morning, they found James at the bottom of the pile, buried beneath the bodies of his closest companions. The humiliation did not end there. Looters stripped the corpses for profit. When they reached the king, they found him naked and discovered the iron belt wrapped around his waist. The secret penance he had carried for years lay exposed in the cold morning air. Far away in London, Catherine of Aragon received the news with grim satisfaction. She wrote to her husband, Henry VIII, in France, remarking coldly that while he was conquering French towns, she had captured King. She even proposed sending James's preserved body as a trophy. Advisors suggested that might be excessive, even by Tudor standards. Instead, she sent Henry something else, James's blood-soaked surcoat, shredded by billhooks. "I send you the piece of the King of Scots coat for your banners," she wrote. It was the ultimate statement of power. James IV's story ended not in a royal tomb, but as a war souvenir. When dawn rose on September 11th, the scale of the disaster became clear. England had lost perhaps 500 men. Scotland had lost more than 10,000. But in medieval war, numbers lie. England lost soldiers. Scotland lost its government. Alongside the king lay an archbishop, 2 abbots, 12 earls, 14 lords, and nearly every major clan leader. There is a saying in Scotland that after Flodden, no noble house was left untouched by grief. An entire ruling generation vanished in one afternoon. The psychological wound never healed. Scotland's Renaissance dream died in that mud, replaced by instability, child kings, and eventual union under English rule. Flodden is remembered not with triumph, but with mourning. The Flowers of the Forest, the most haunting Scottish lament, was written for this very loss, the young men who marched south and never returned. When bagpipes play that melody, you're hearing a nation break. 500 years later, Flodden still speaks. It reminds us that technology does not guarantee victory. James had the best guns, the best armor, the most modern army. He had the Ferrari, and he lost to a battered pickup truck driven by men who understood the ground. It warns us about pride. James fought the war he wanted to fight, not the one that existed beneath his boots. And in the end, the iron belt he wore as punishment became prophecy. He sought redemption in death and found it dragging his kingdom down with him. Today, the field of Flodden is quiet. The blood is gone. The mud is dry. But if you stand there on a cold September afternoon and listen to the wind moving through the grass, you can almost hear the warning echo across the centuries. The brightest flowers are often the first to be cut down.